For years, the future of cars looked completely decided. Every headline pointed in the same direction. Electric vehicles were taking over. Tesla had transformed from a risky startup into the company that forced the entire auto industry to change. BYD was flooding markets with cheaper batteries, lower prices, and faster production. Governments announced deadlines for petrol engines. Charging stations started appearing everywhere. And slowly, people stopped asking if electric cars would dominate the future, and started asking when. Then Toyota did something strange. While almost every major automaker was racing toward batteries, Toyota kept talking about something most people thought was already dead: hydrogen. At first, almost nobody took it seriously. Critics called Toyota outdated. Some analysts even claimed the company had missed the biggest technological shift in decades. Because from the outside, Toyota's decision looked confusing. This wasn't some small company struggling to adapt. This was one of the largest automakers on Earth, a company with the money, engineers, factories, and global influence to dominate EVs if it wanted to. But instead of going all in on batteries, Toyota hesitated, and that hesitation may end up becoming one of the most important decisions in the future of transportation, because hidden behind all the EV headlines was a problem almost nobody wanted to talk about yet. A problem involving charging times, battery weight, electricity demand, and the simple reality that not every country was ready for a fully electric future. Toyota saw that problem early. But what makes this story uncomfortable is that Toyota didn't just question electric cars. It questioned the idea that the entire world would move in only one direction, and once you understand why, the entire EV race starts looking very different. A few years ago, if someone mentioned the future of transportation, the answer sounded obvious: battery-powered vehicles, silent motors, fast acceleration, zero emissions. It felt inevitable. Tesla helped create that feeling. Before Tesla, electric cars were often seen as small, slow, and boring. But Tesla changed the psychology of the market. Suddenly, EVs became fast, desirable, high-tech. They weren't compromises anymore. They became status symbols. Then China accelerated everything. Companies like BYD moved so aggressively that global automakers started panicking. Battery costs dropped. Production exploded. EV adoption surged. Entire governments started building policies around electrification. And in the middle of all this, Toyota looked almost disconnected from reality. The company kept repeating the same thing over and over again: the future will not rely on one technology. At first, that sounded like corporate hesitation. Maybe Toyota was simply afraid of change. Maybe it didn't want to abandon petrol engines too quickly. That's what many people believed. But Toyota's engineers were thinking about a very different question. What happens when billions of people all try to charge vehicles at the same time? Not in wealthy cities with modern infrastructure. Everywhere, what happens in countries where electricity grids are unstable, where charging networks barely exist, where long-distance commercial transport cannot afford hours of downtime? That question quietly pushed Toyota toward a path almost everyone else ignored: hydrogen now. Most people hear the word hydrogen and immediately imagine futuristic technology that feels impossible to understand. But the basic idea is actually simple. Instead of using petrol, a vehicle uses hydrogen as fuel. The strange part is that Toyota wasn't only experimenting with one type of hydrogen vehicle. It was exploring two completely different systems at the same time. The first was hydrogen fuel cells. In this system, hydrogen creates electricity through a chemical reaction, and that electricity powers an electric motor. In other words, it behaves more like an EV than a traditional car. But the second idea was far more controversial: a hydrogen combustion engine, an actual engine, pistons, combustion, sound, mechanical, feeling. Except instead of burning petrol, it burns hydrogen. And this is where the story starts becoming far more complicated than most people realize, because Toyota wasn't simply trying to create another EV alternative, it was trying to preserve something the industry was preparing to abandon completely: the driving experience itself. For many people, electric vehicles feel impressive. Instant torque, smooth acceleration, quiet operation. But for others, something feels missing: the sound, the response, the mechanical sensation of an engine working beneath you. Toyota noticed that emotional gap, so instead of eliminating combustion entirely, the company started asking a dangerous question. What if combustion itself wasn't the real enemy? What if the fuel was? That idea changed everything. Toyota began experimenting with adapting existing engine architectures to work with hydrogen. Instead of rebuilding manufacturing systems from zero, engineers focused on modifying fuel injection systems, combustion timing, thermal management, and airflow. The goal wasn't just cleaner transportation, it was continuity, keeping the feeling people already understood while changing the fuel powering it. And honestly, this is the point where Tesla enters the story in a very different way. Because Tesla's strategy depends on one massive assumption, that batteries become the dominant global solution for transportation. Everything inside Tesla's empire points toward that: future gigafactories, battery supply chains, charging infrastructure, software ecosystems. The company has spent years building an entire world around batteries, and BYD followed a similar path. Its strength comes from controlling battery production at enormous scale, lower costs, faster manufacturing, vertical integration. But Toyota's hydrogen strategy introduces a possibility neither company can ignore. What if batteries dominate passenger cars, but fail to solve other industries? What if the biggest transportation battle of the future doesn't happen in sedans at all? Because this only becomes important once you look at trucks, freight, transport, industrial logistics, massive vehicles moving non-stop across countries every day. This is where the story starts getting uncomfortable. A passenger EV charging overnight at home is one thing, but a commercial truck sitting idle for hours to recharge becomes a business problem. Downtime costs money, and suddenly hydrogen starts looking less like a fantasy and more like a practical alternative. Refuel in minutes, return to operation immediately, long range without massive battery weight. That possibility is exactly why hydrogen never fully disappeared. Even while EVs exploded in popularity, governments and industries quietly kept funding hydrogen research behind the scenes. Japan invested heavily. Europe explored hydrogen for industrial transition. China began studying hydrogen for heavy transport applications. The United States continued funding hydrogen infrastructure and logistics. Research. And Toyota stayed in the middle of all of it. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just patiently continuing development while most of the world focused somewhere else. But there's a reason hydrogen still hasn't taken over, and this is the part most optimistic. Videos avoid talking about infrastructure. Hydrogen sounds simple until you try building an entire system around it. The fuel has to be produced, compressed, transported, stored under extremely high pressure, and delivered safely. Hydrogen stations are expensive. Supply chains are complicated. Production costs remain high in many regions, and compared to EV charging networks, hydrogen infrastructure looks tiny. That's why many experts still believe batteries will remain dominant for everyday vehicles. Because even if Toyota's technology works perfectly, technology alone doesn't decide the future. Economics do, timing does, infrastructure does, and Toyota may have entered the race too early. But maybe that's exactly why the company keeps going, because Toyota has experienced this before. Years ago, when hybrids first appeared, many people dismissed them as unnecessary compromises. Companies chased larger engines and more horsepower. While Toyota quietly invested in fuel efficiency, then fuel prices changed. Consumer priorities changed, and hybrids became mainstream. Remembers that, which may explain why the company refuses to abandon hydrogen even while the rest of the industry pushes batteries harder every year. But the environmental debate makes this story even harder to predict. Because neither side is completely clean. EVs avoid tailpipe emissions, but battery production raises questions about mining raw materials and recycling. Hydrogen vehicles can produce extremely low direct emissions, especially fuel cell systems. But producing hydrogen itself often requires large amounts of energy. That's why the real debate is no longer about perfect solutions. It's about trade-offs, which compromises become acceptable, which systems scale faster, which technologies fit different parts of the world. And maybe the biggest mistake people made was assuming there would only be one answer, because transportation isn't one problem. Cities have different needs than rural regions. Commercial fleets have different needs than personal vehicles. Wealthy countries have different infrastructure than developing economies, and Toyota's entire strategy revolves around one idea most companies stopped considering. The future may split instead of unify. Batteries in some places, hydrogen in others. Hybrids continuing longer than expected, multiple systems existing. At the same time, that possibility changes the entire story. Because suddenly, Toyota doesn't look like a company that ignored the future. It looks like a company preparing for a future where nobody fully wins, and maybe that's the real reason hydrogen still matters.